Hello, I'm Alma Angeles, and you're watching Eagle News International. Joining me is Ms. CJ Hero. Hello, CJ.
Good evening, Alma, and good evening to everyone watching the news tonight. Here are the headlines.
President Duterte remains safe and in good health, even after many of his security aides have tested positive for COVID-19, according to his Presidential Security Group, or PSG commander, Brigadier General Jesus Durante III.
Oxford University said a British trial of the AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine on children has been paused as global regulators rush to assess its possible link to rare blood clots in adults.
Indonesia's Navy readied hospital ships Wednesday to help treat injured survivors of a cyclone that has killed about 160 in the archipelago and neighboring East Timor, as fears grow over coronavirus outbreaks in cramped evacuation centers.
21 April.
And accelerated vaccinations and a flood of government spending, especially in the United States, have boosted the outlook for the global economy.
The average annual loss in per capita GDP.
First, in the Philippines, President Duterte remains safe and in good health, even after many of his security aides have tested positive for the coronavirus. That is according to Presidential Security Group, or PSG commander, Brigadier General Jesus Durante III. Durante said in a press statement, quote, at least our PSG personnel who got infected are not directly or closely detailed with the president and are all asymptomatic without experiencing any adverse symptom. Hence, rest assured that the president is safe and in good health. He gave the assurance after over 100 PSG personnel have contracted COVID-19. Durante, in an interview with state-run PTV4, said a total of 126 PSG members have been infected with the coronavirus, and to date, there are 45 active COVID cases in the PSG. Durante said most of the infected security personnel are those manning the gates within the Malacanang compound and exposed daily to people. He said the PSG personnel's exposure to COVID-19 is inevitable because they protect our VIPs and guard the PSG compound, the residents, and the whole Malacanang complex 24/7. Durante said the PSG would only recommend the resumption of Duterte's activities once COVID cases in Metro Manila subside. Meanwhile, the spike in coronavirus cases has prompted President Duterte to postpone his scheduled talk to the people this week.
Staying here in the Philippines, Justice Secretary Menardo Guevara on Wednesday assured government action on a human smuggling scheme using closed vans to illegally transport persons out of the National Capital Region plus areas, which are currently under an enhanced community quarantine. Dugade earlier said closed vans and trucks were being used to smuggle people outside Metro Manila to waiting vans outside the coverage of the ECQ, raising concerns about the possibility of a new mode of transmission of the COVID-19 virus. The announcement came after a video circulated on social media showing people inside a container truck with none of the individuals wearing face masks somewhere between Quezon province and the Bicol region, roughly 8 hours from Metro Manila. Passengers contacted by the smugglers on social media are reportedly instructed to go to a pickup point and are taken out of the NCR Plus bubble, which remains on lockdown until April 11, following a surge in the number of COVID-19 cases. Apart from Metro Manila, included in the NCR Plus areas are the provinces of Cavite, Laguna, Rizal, and Bulacan.
A British trial of the AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine on children has been paused, according to Oxford University, as global regulators rush to assess its possible link to rare blood clots in adults. The university, which helped develop the embattled vaccine, said in a statement that there were no safety concerns in the trial, but acknowledged fears over a potential link to clots by saying that it was awaiting additional data from Britain's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or MHRA, before restarting the study. The MHRA is one of many bodies across the globe analyzing real-world data from the AstraZeneca rollout to see if there is a definitive link between the jab and a rare form of blood clot, after cases were initially reported in Norway and continental Europe. The MHRA reported over the weekend that there had been 30 blood clotting cases, 7 fatal out of the 18 million doses administered in Britain. The European Medicines Agency said Tuesday it hasn't yet reached a conclusion and the review is currently ongoing.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's home state, Gujarat, became the latest to tighten coronavirus curbs on Wednesday as India's infections surged to a record of almost 116,000 new cases in 24 hours. Experts blame the country's fresh wave on people ignoring guidelines and attending huge religious and political events, as well as weddings and cricket matches in the recent months. India has now recorded funerals and weddings to 50 guests and 104 outdoors. Chief Minister Amarinder Singh said it was also a matter of concern that over 85% of cases in Punjab are of the UK strain, which is more contagious and virulent. Press reports say that hospitals are starting to suffer, particularly in Maharashtra.
Meanwhile, unpaid carer L. Taylor, 24 years old, becomes the first person in the UK to receive the Moderna vaccine against COVID-19 at the West Wales General Hospital in Carmarthen. Let's take a look.
I'm an unpaid carer for my grandmother, so it's very important to me that I can get it so that I can care for her properly and be safe.
Of recipients. Oxford University said late Tuesday that it had paused a British trial of the AstraZeneca vaccine on children. The university said the trial had posed no safety concerns, but that it was awaiting more data from Britain's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, before restarting the study.
Well done. Thank you. Terrific. Nice Catherine.
In other news, nurses at a mass vaccination center at M&T Bank Stadium in Baltimore have administered 100,000 COVID-19 vaccines since opening a month ago. The United States is now reaping the fruits of its vaccination campaign as it is now the first nation to reach 100 million people. Watch this.
My parents that are 80.
We can vaccinate, we think, up to 7,000 people a day. At our most, we've done about 5,000, but we continue to increase capacity. And today we hit our 100,000th vaccination.
I happen to personally have metastatic breast cancer, and I haven't been able to be around my parents that are 89 years old, and also my grandchildren. I have 6 grandchildren, and I've just missed them so much. So this means the world to me.
I think it's still going to take a while for the whole world, though, but, you know, it certainly seems like in countries that are getting the vaccinations, it's going to help a lot. So hopefully, you know, we never know what the variants. There's always possibilities that things can crop up, of course, also in the future, but it looks pretty promising, I think.
The United States reaped the fruits Friday of its vaccination campaign against COVID-19 as it became the first nation again to reach 100 million people. Led by a revival in the leisure and hospitality industries, the U.S. economy created a mammoth 916,000 jobs in March, the Labor Department said. But infections remain on the rise in parts of the United States, prompting Biden to urge Americans to keep wearing masks and taking other precautions to stop the pandemic that has now killed more than 2.8 million people worldwide.
Meanwhile, Australia's Prime Minister blamed restricted vaccine supply from Europe for his country's halting coronavirus inoculation efforts as he faced growing public frustration over the sluggish rollout. Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, said vaccine shortages and strict export controls introduced by the European Commission meant that Australia received just 700,000 of the contracted 3.8 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Take a look.
Overnight, there have been some statements made by the European Union in relation to vaccine supply. And so I'm joined with the Secretary of Health here today just to run through some facts about the nature of supply of vaccines from Europe. First of all, I want to stress that at no time yesterday did I make any comment about the actions of the European Union, nor did I indicate any of the background reasons for the lack of supply that we have received from those contracted doses. And so any suggestion that I in any way made any criticism of the European Union yesterday would be completely incorrect. I simply stated a fact, that 3.1 million of the contracted vaccines that we had been relying upon in early January, when we'd set out a series of targets, did not turn up in Australia. That is just a simple fact.
His government, which received global praise for successfully containing Australia's coronavirus outbreak, has fallen far behind its vaccine rollout schedule. It had initially pledged to administer 4 million doses by the end of March, but had instead managed about 920,000 shots by Wednesday, drawing increasing criticism that Morrison tried to address at a hastily organized press conference. Australia has received around 870,000 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which it is administering to frontline workers. Authorities had been counting on imported and locally made AstraZeneca shots to cover most of the population. But trouble surfaced last month when Italy blocked the export of 250,000 AstraZeneca doses as it struggled to cope with a severe coronavirus crisis at home, a delay Morrison's government insisted would not affect its overall vaccine rollout plan.
In other news, Indonesia's army or navy readied hospital ships Wednesday to help treat injured survivors of a cyclone that has killed about 160 people now in the archipelago and neighboring East Timor as fears grow over coronavirus outbreaks in cramped evacuation shelters. Helicopters were also dropping food and other essentials into remote villages, while sniffer dogs were deployed to search for the dozens still missing after weekend floods and landslides devastated the Southeast Asian nations. Torrential rains from tropical cyclone Seroja, one of the most destructive storms to hit the region in years, turned small communities into wastelands of mud and uprooted trees, sending thousands fleeing to shelters. The hospital ships were due to leave for the storm-hit region from Jakarta and Semarang, a city east of Indonesia's capital, said Raditya Jati, spokesman for the disaster agency. The agency also said sniffer dogs would hunt through mountains of debris and rubble for the bodies of more than 70 still missing victims and any survivors.
Meanwhile, dramatic footage shows a crew member of a Dutch cargo ship throwing himself into the sea after the ship began listing heavily and was too dangerous to stay aboard. Norwegian Emergency Services rescued the 12 crew members of the IMS lift Hendrika, with some being airlifted to safety and others having to jump into the water. Take a look.
We should be, because Taiwan has been with us from the beginning. The partnership that we've created over the last 20 years as diplomatic allies, you can't just throw that out the door. You know, it was built on trust, it was built on cooperation, it was built on mutual friendship, and I've had meetings with them, and the first thing they said to me before on a phone call was, what you're doing is illegal. Recognizing Taiwan is illegal. You need to stop it. You know, that's the tone they use. And, you know, we're a free and democratic country. We have a right to choose what we believe, and we believe in freedom and democracy. And it's just a different approach.
我们对有关的言论坚决反对。众所周知，一个中国原则是世界上大多数国家、绝大多数国家奉行的原则。
China claims democratic self-ruled Taiwan as its own territory and has vowed to one day seize it by force if necessary. Beijing has largely opted for the diplomatic stick when it comes to Palau recently. Located around 900 kilometers east of the Philippines, Palau saw explosive growth in the number of Chinese tourists in the early half of the last decade. But in 2017, China suddenly banned package tours, a common move to apply economic stress. That decision, Whips believes, backfired because it heightened Palauan awareness of Chinese pressure. That skepticism is music to Washington's ears as it tries to shore up alliances in the Pacific to counter Beijing's growing regional clout. Palau was one of the group of Pacific islands administered by the United States in the aftermath of World War II. It became independent in 1994, but maintains close links with Washington. Like other nearby Pacific nations, it has a 50-year defense agreement with the United States known as the Compact of Free Association, or COFA. U.S. forces are under Japanese pressure to draw down their massive bases in Okinawa and are looking to diversify across the Pacific.
In other news, the truck that caused Taiwan's worst train crash in decades was on the line for just over a minute before it was struck, according to officials, as salvage teams are now working to remove the most damaged carriages. At least 50 people were killed and more than 210 were injured in Friday's crash, which sent a packed 8-car train hurtling into the sides of a narrow tunnel near the eastern coastal city of Hualien. Investigators say the Taroko Express hit a railway maintenance truck on the line in a head-on collision moments before it entered the tunnel. Now the vehicle slipped down a steep embankment, and prosecutors are working to determine whether the driver failed to secure the parking brake or if the truck suffered a mechanical failure. Investigators gave an update on Tuesday which revealed how close the victims were to avoiding disaster. Officials said the train would have required a distance of 600 meters, almost 2,000 feet, or 16.6 seconds to fully stop. But when the truck came into view, there was only around 250 meters or 6.9 seconds in which to act. Friday's crash took place at the start of the Tomb Sweeping Festival, a 4-day public holiday in Taiwan, when many Taiwanese return to villages to tidy the graves of their ancestors.
Meanwhile, a group representing Myanmar's ousted civilian government said Wednesday it has gathered 180,000 pieces of evidence showing rights abuses by the junta, including torture and extrajudicial killings. The country has been in turmoil since the army deposed civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi on February 1, with nearly 600 people killed in a crackdown on anti-coup protests. A lawyer for the Committee for Representing Pidong Su, Lutao, or CRPH, a group of MPs from Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy Party, met UN investigators Wednesday to discuss alleged atrocities by the junta. The group said the CRPH has received 180,000 items of evidence, and this evidence shows wide-scale abuses of human rights by the military. They include more than 540 extrajudicial executions, 10 deaths of prisoners in custody, torture, illegal detentions, and disproportionate use of force against peaceful protests, the statement said. Demonstrations calling for the return of democracy and the release of Suu Kyi from detention have rocked Myanmar almost daily since the coup. Civil servants, doctors, and other key workers have downed tools as part of a civil disobedience movement aimed at preventing the military from running the country.
Carlos Mayorga, a candidate for federal representative in Mexico's Ciudad Juarez on the border with the U.S., launched his election campaign inside a coffin to draw attention to the dead left by the coronavirus pandemic and the violence linked to organized crime. Take a look.
Han guardado silencio ante los altos índices de crimen organizado, han guardado silencio ante la situación caótica del COVID.
Mayorga, a lower house candidate for the Encuentro Solidario Party in the northern state of Chihuahua, said he was sending a message to politicians that people were dying because of their indifference. Mayorga arrived inside a gold-colored casket at a campaign rally on a bridge between the Mexican border city of Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, Texas. More than 300,000 people have been murdered in Mexico since the government deployed the military in the war on drugs in 2006, according to official figures. The campaign for June midterm elections has brought a wave of political violence, which has seen 16 candidates murdered.
Now, China accused the United States of politicizing sports on Wednesday after Washington said it would discuss calls to boycott the Beijing Olympics with its allies after growing pressure to shun the Winter Games on human rights grounds. Watch this.
将体育运动政治化，有违奥林匹克宪章精神，损害的是各国运动员的利益和国际奥林匹克事业，包括美国奥委会在内的国际社会不会接受。
Republican politicians in the U.S. have led calls for a boycott of the Olympics, in part over what rights monitors say is the mass incarceration and indoctrination of more than 1 million Uyghurs and other mostly Muslim people in the northwestern region of Xinjiang. China has rejected the claims and said Wednesday that allegations of genocide are, quote, the lie of the century from top to bottom. President Joe Biden's administration has repeatedly kept the door open to boycotting the Olympics without announcing any firm direction. The United States led a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, with the Soviet bloc snubbing the Summer Games in Los Angeles 4 years later in retaliation. The Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics has already launched a series of test events. There are also doubts about how the Games in February next year will deal with the coronavirus. A top Beijing 2022 official recently admitted that the pandemic makes it a big challenge to host a smooth Winter Olympics. Organizers plan to run 10 days of testing at 5 locations in Olympic and Paralympic sports.
The news continues here on Eagle News. CJ and I will be back right after this short break.
This portion is brought to you by Canriv Corporation, your ventilation and air conditioning specialist. Services offered: supply and installation of elevators, escalators, air conditioners, ventilators, jet towel, hand dryers, generators, access control system, factory automation, and modernization. For more info, please contact Ami Kanke at 0915-263-7198 or 0998-900-3224.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Welcome back. Accelerated vaccinations and a flood of government spending, especially in the U.S., have boosted the outlook for the global economy. But more must be done to prevent permanent scars, according to IMF chief economist Gita Gobinath. And she said this while presenting the 2021 World Economic Outlook. The International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook now sees global growth of 6% this year, after the contraction of 3.3% in 2020 caused by the pandemic, the worst peacetime downturn since the Great Depression a century before.
April. Now, these divergent recovery paths are likely to create wider gaps in living standards across countries compared to pre-pandemic expectations. The average annual loss in per capita GDP over 2020 to 24 relative to pre-pandemic forecasts is projected to be 5.7% in low-income countries and 4.7% in emerging markets, while in advanced economies, the losses are expected to be smaller at 2.3%. Now, because the crisis has accelerated the transformative forces of digitalization and automation, many of the jobs lost are unlikely to return, requiring worker reallocation across sectors, which unfortunately often comes with severe earning penalties. Swift policy action worldwide, including $16 trillion in fiscal support, prevented far worse outcomes. Our estimates suggest last year's severe collapse could have been 3 times worse. A high degree of uncertainty surrounds our projections. Faster progress with vaccinations can uplift the forecast, while a more prolonged pandemic with virus variants that evade vaccines can lead to a sharp downgrade. Multi-speed recoveries could pose financial risks if interest rates in the United States rise further in unexpected ways. This could cause inflated asset valuations to unwind in a disorderly manner. Right now, the emphasis should be on escaping the health crisis by prioritizing healthcare spending on vaccinations, treatments, healthcare infrastructure. Fiscal support should be well targeted to affected households and firms, and monetary policy should remain accommodative, while proactively addressing financial stability risks. First and foremost, countries need to work together to ensure universal vaccination. While some countries will get to widespread vaccinations by the summer, most will likely have to wait till the end of next year. Speeding up vaccinations will require ramping up vaccine production and distribution, avoiding export controls, fully funding COVAX facility, and ensuring equitable global transfers of excess doses.
In other business news, South Korea's two biggest electronics firms both forecast jumps of around 40% in the first quarter operating profits Wednesday, with coronavirus-driven working from home fueling global demand for semiconductors and home appliances. Tech behemoth Samsung Electronics said in an earnings estimate that it expected operating profit of 9.3 trillion won, or about $8.3 billion, for January to March, up 44.2% from a year earlier, largely driven by robust sales of smartphones and the launch of its flagship Galaxy S21 series. Meanwhile, LG Electronics, South Korea's second largest appliance firm after Samsung, forecast a 39.2% jump in operating profit for the same period to 1.5 trillion won. Samsung Electronics is the flagship subsidiary of the giant Samsung Group, by far the largest of the family-controlled empires known as chaebols that dominate business in South Korea, the world's 12th largest economy. It is crucial to the country's economic health. The conglomerate's overall turnover is equivalent to a fifth of the national gross domestic product.
In other business news, Deliveroo shares rose Wednesday on the takeaway app's first full trading day, in contrast to last week's London stock market launch, when they crashed after being snubbed by institutional investors. Deliveroo shares gained 2.7% to 287.65 pence, giving the group a market value of 5.3 billion pounds, or $7.3 billion US dollars, as small investors joined in the trading. It also coincided with a number of Deliveroo riders striking over pay and conditions across a handful of English cities. Deliveroo's initial public offering, or IPO, on March 31 was London's biggest stock market launch for a decade, valuing the group at 7.6 billion pounds after the 8-year-old company enjoyed surging sales during the pandemic as lockdown people ordered in. But its IPO of 390 pence failed spectacularly, with the group losing 26% of its value on its first conditional trading day. The group faced criticism from some institutional investors over the treatment of self-employed riders. Deliveroo maintains that its riders, around 100,000 across 800 cities worldwide, value the flexibility the job affords. However, its business model has come under scrutiny, including in Britain, France, and Spain, over conditions. Group founder and chief executive Will Shu has also been criticized for adopting a dual-class share structure that gives him 20 votes per share compared with 1 vote per share for all other stockholders.
Here in the Philippines now, a total of 522 rail workers of the 4 rail services in the National Capital Region have so far tested positive for the coronavirus disease, or COVID-19, according to the latest data from the Department of Transportation, or DOTR. In an advisory on Wednesday, the DOTR said 377 out of 1,185 workers of the Light Rail Transit Line 1 or LRT1 have been tested with 117 yielding positive results. In the LRT Line 2, it said 571 out of its 1,277 workers have been tested, with 143 returning positive for COVID-19. In the Metro Rail Transit Line 3 or MRT3, it said 860 out of its 3,284 workers have been tested, with 131 found to be infected. In the Philippine National Railways or PNR, it said 1,013 out of its 1,729 workers have so far undergone testing, with 131 returning positive with COVID-19. The test results were recorded on Tuesday. Due to the limited number of personnel, operations of the PNR are currently suspended, while the rest are on or operating on a limited capacity. To date, the LRT1 is dispatching 17 trains. LRT2 has 5 trains, while the MRT3 has 14 trains. On Monday, the DOTR reported a total of 478 confirmed infections from the 4 rail services.
Dr. Mike Ryan, WHO, who leads WHO's Public Health Emergencies Program, said that people should not be required to prove they have been vaccinated against COVID-19 in order to travel overseas. However, Dr. Ryan said WHO officials had only temporarily recommended against vaccine passports for international travel. The organization would reconsider the issue at a meeting on April 15. Let's listen in.
So having proper certification and recording of vaccination is very important. That's a different consideration to what those certificates are used for outside the health space. And that would be health certification of vaccination being used to attend work, to attend school, to attend events, to travel nationally or internationally. They are not necessarily related to the health of the individual, but to other factors. And this is a complex issue. It has both considerations around how such certification could be utilised to reduce transmission, but also around knowledge around the impact of vaccination itself and the way in which vaccination may or may not prevent transmission. And there are ethical issues here regarding equity. We already have a huge issue with vaccine equity in the world. The imposition of requirements for certification of vaccination before travel could introduce another layer of such inequity. If you don't have access to vaccine in a country, then you effectively become isolated as a country as vaccine passports kick in. So there are many, many, many issues. Currently, WHO, or through the Emergency Committee of the International Health Regulations, have made temporary recommendations to the Director General that proof of vaccination should not be a requirement, be required for the purposes of international travel. That group will meet again, I believe, on the 15th of April, and I'm sure that recommendation will be under consideration. In the meantime, we are bringing together our Strategic and Technical Advisory Group on Infectious Hazards with the Strategic Advisory Group on Immunisation and the Ethics Advisory Group of WHO together to look at these issues. And currently we have an internal working group really pulling together both the scientific data, social data, the ethical data, so we can come and get the best possible external advice in order to advise our member states.
Eagle News will be back for more updates. Please don't go away.
Bored during quarantine? Nako, worry no more.
Dahil sagot na namin ang entertainment at pasabog.
Hatid na mga talented singers from Visayas and Mindanao.
Na makikipagtagitan this whole month of April.
Just once, can we sabihin mo na?
Kaya naman, tutok na dahil tuloy-tuloy ang kantahan at biritan dito sa biggest talent competition on Philippine TV and online. This is Tagisan ng Galing Part 2
Online Edition. Tawagin na natin ang pinakagwapo, napakagwapo, ladies and gentlemen. Let us all welcome Victor Juan!
Nagustuhan nila Derek at Sir Orly yung performance nyo. Kaya sa next episode, mag-partner na kayo.
Record ka ang sarili mong album. Wala. Hindi papatok yung ganyan style.
Payagan nyo lang ako mag-record uli.
I'm sorry, my love, if I've broken your heart.
Si Arceli nga po pala, fiancé ko.
Hindi ka naman dapat kabahan eh.
To forgive me.
Kapag nakapag-ipon ako, papakasal na tayo.
Ihanda nyo na yung kontrata schedules. Ilalabas na natin to sa buong Pilipinas.
Let me kiss and hold you tight.
Kalahati lang ng TF ni Rico at ni Ray yung TF ko eh.
Kung sino ang mas sikat, yun ang mas may malaking talent fee.
Eh kung kasikatan lang ang pag-uusapan, masikat naman ako sa mga yan.
Noon yun, Victor. Pero hindi mo inalagaan.
Kaya kong bumangon kahit wala ka.
Broadcast journalist Juan de la Fuente returns on Philippine television and radio to deliver top stories and engage with the country's policymakers, shapers, and movers. Tatalakayin ang mga pangunahing balita alas 7 ng umaga mula Lunes hanggang Biyernes, live sa teleradyo ng Net25 at Radyo Aguila DCEC 1062. Kasama si Juan de la Fuente sa Balitalakayan.
Welcome back to the news. Nepal is experiencing its worst fire season in almost a decade, officials said Tuesday, as huge blazes rage across the country's forests, engulfing the Himalayan nation in a shroud of brownish haze. Watch this.
American actor Zach Avery, Avery, was arrested by FBI agents in Los Angeles for allegedly masterminding a Ponzi scheme that defrauded investors of hundreds of millions of dollars, according to U.S. authorities. Avery, whose real name is Zachary Horwitz, told investors his company, the 1M or 11 NMMM Capital, would buy film distribution rights and license them to Netflix and HBO, but in fact had no business relationship with either company, according to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Instead, the 34-year-old operated the company as a Ponzi scheme, using money from new investors to pay older ones. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Central District of California said this in a statement. The SEC said his scheme had raised more than $690 million, according to the Department of Justice, and it began in 2015. That $227 million put in by victims was yet to be repaid. Horwitz, described by the Los Angeles Times as a small-time actor, failed to find success as an actor So he also starred in the critically panned 2020 film Last Moment of Clarity. He allegedly used money from the scheme to fund a lavish lifestyle, which authorities said included trips to Las Vegas, buying a house worth $6 million, and paying a celebrity interior designer. Authorities said the scheme had started in 2015 and that Horvitz and the Juan and MM promised victims returns of more than 35%. To establish his legitimacy, Horvitz provided investors with fake license agreements, as well as fake distribution agreements with Netflix and HBO, all of which contained forged or fictional signatures, according to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Horvitz has been charged with wire fraud, and he could face up to 20 years in prison if convicted.
Meanwhile, a Sri Lankan beauty pageant winner who had her crown yanked in a ghastly catwalk fight is ready to forgive, but calls mounted Wednesday for tough action against her attackers. Beauty queen Pushpika De Silva won the Mrs. Sri Lanka title on a ceremony at a ceremony on national TV on Sunday. Moments later, the 2019 winner seized Mrs. De Silva's crown, claiming she could not be awarded the title because she was divorced. She was recrowned at a smaller ceremony on Tuesday. But first, watch this.
20 goes to none other than contestant number 20. Another big round of applause to the lady who will be taking Mother Sri Lanka head-on-head with the rest of the world.
As per the Mrs. World Inc., there is a rule that you all have to be married and not divorced. So, I'm taking my first step saying that the crown goes to the first runner-up.
හරිම කනගාටුයි කියන්න මම හරිම disappointed ඒක ගැන මොකද කවදාකවත් කාන්තාවකගේ අනාගතය වෙනුවෙන් කවුරු හරි කෙනෙක් ඒ කෙනාගේ ඉදිරියට යන ගමන නවත්තන්න හදනවා නම් කවුරු හරි කෙනෙක්ට රිද්දලා ඒ රිද්දන දෙයින් කවුරු හරි කෙනෙක් සතුටක් ලබනවා නම් මම හිතන්නේ එයා ඒක ලබන ජයග්‍රහණයක් නෙමෙයි ඒක පරාජයක් මේ දෙයින් කවුරු හරි කෙනෙක් බලාපොරොත්තු වුණා නම් වටන්න මගේ ඉදිරි අනාගත ගමන වළක්වන්න මම හිතන්නේ ඒගොල්ලොන්ට ඒ දේ කරන්න පුළුවන් කියලා මම යකඩ ගෑනියේ ඒ ක්‍රවුන් එක අරගන්න මට ලොකුම බලාපොරොත්තු උනේ මම වගේ දරුවෙක් එක්ක තනි වුණ සිංගල් මම් ඒ වගේ ගෑනු අද ලංකාවේ ගොඩක් දුක් විඳිනවා ඒගොල්ලන්ට මේ කිරුණ මගේ නෙමෙයි අත්තටම ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ මම හිතන්නේ මේ කිරුණෙන් ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ අනාගතය එලි කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් ඒක තමයි මගේ සතුට
20 goes to
the winner of Sri Lanka's biggest beauty prize, who suffered head injuries after a rival tried to steal her crown, says she was disappointed over the incident but had forgiven those involved. The organizers have apologized to Mrs. De Silva, who says she is separated but not divorced. In a Facebook post, she said she went to hospital to be treated for head injuries after the incident. Mrs. De Silva said she would take legal action for the unreasonable and insulting way she was treated. Police have questioned the Mrs. Jury, who is the current holder of the Mrs. World title, as well as Mr. Jaya Singh, about the incident. The Mrs. Sri Lanka World Beauty Pageant is a major contest in the country. The Prime Minister's wife was among the guests at the ceremony.
To other news now, it's Tokyo, but unlike you've seen it before, a miniaturized 1 to 1,000 scale version of one of the world's biggest capitals, displaying everything from sea levels to population densities. Pairing a 3D model with projection mapping, the Urban Lab project at Tokyo's Mori building aims to display information about the Japanese capital in different and visually arresting ways. Take a look.
東京というのは別に今に始まった災害と付き合うのが始まったわけではなくて、長い歴史の中でまさに人類の英知というか、自然とともに自然にあがなうではなくて自然とともに、一緒に共生をしていく、これが都市の在り方だと思っていますので、これから我々も街づくりをする、もしくは東京という街が目指す時には災害に対していかに我々の街づくりは実際そうなんですけども、逃げる街ではなくて逃げ込める街、こういったことをいろんなこの都市の中でしっかり構築していくっていうことが大事なんじゃないでしょうか。
Meanwhile, NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory releases the first photos of the Ingenuity mini helicopter on the surface of Mars. Take a look. Now, this was after it survived its first night alone on the frigid surface of the red planet. The ultralight aircraft was dropped on the surface on Saturday after detaching from the belly of the Perseverance rover, which touched down on February 18. Detached from the Perseverance, Ingenuity had to rely on its own solar-powered battery to run a vital heater to protect its shielded electrical components from freezing and cracking during the bitter Martian night, where temperatures can plunge as low as minus 130 degrees Fahrenheit or about minus 90 degrees Celsius. Over the coming days, the Ingenuity will undergo tests of its rotor blades and motors. If all goes well, Ingenuity is expected to make its first flight attempt no earlier than the evening of April 11, according to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It's always exciting to see the surface of other planets.
Yes. Will that be our next go-to list?
That's on the list now. Well, that's it for tonight's broadcast. Thank you so much for watching us. I am CJ Hero. Please join us again tomorrow.
And at the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. We'll see you back tomorrow. I'm Alma Angeles, and
we live
in interesting times.